natural resource policy and a conservationist understanding of right natural resource policy. Conservationists believe that right natural resource policy is definable with reference solely to the felt preferences of affected persons. There are no moral ideals apart from the ideal of maximizing satisfaction of affected persons immediately, felt preferences, not considered. Remember, I'm drawing on this distinction between considered preferences and felt preferences that I shared with you guys a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about Norton. Remember we had that one class where I went a little deeper into environmental pragmatism? That's probably maybe the second or third week of the term. Third week, probably. Anyway, but conservationists are utilitarians, and they don't have access to anything deeper than what people want, right? And what do people want? Pinchot was aware that, Americans want cheap forest products because, the American dream is to own your own house. And what do we build houses with in North America? Well, we mostly build them with wood because that's what we have. We've got a lot of wood. So we should be harvesting timber as much as possible from our national forests to give everyone the American dream of owning their own home, right? And that's what people want, right? And in those days, there was no notion of limitation. There was no ecological crisis. So what people want seemed to be the most sensible factor to determine how they ought to manage their forests, right? And their other natural resources. People want cheap electricity. The poor housewives in the Dalles and other rural parts of Oregon, for crying out loud, they'd spend 2 or 3 hours every day just washing the clothes and the dishes and stuff. Now we're going to electrify all those rural communities by building these dams. And that's what people want. People want electrification. They want washing machines to wash their clothes. So, that makes perfect sense. But in those days, nobody was provoked into considering those felt preferences, right? And the consequences of over-harvesting timber, the consequences of over-harvesting kilowatts from the river, over-damming the river, right? Nobody thought about that. They made their policies on the basis of people's felt preferences, right? Now we're a little wiser. And we realize that many of these felt preferences are inconsistent with a sustainable future of humankind and other higher life forms on this planet. Anyway, so environmental pragmatists comes along and the pragmatists deny that felt preference satisfaction is the only measure of right natural resource policy, and it can't be the only measure. Human ideals identified through the considered preferences of affected persons, in other words, identification of the valuable as opposed to just the valued, set limits on preference satisfaction, okay? Considered, once we consider our preferences, our felt preferences, they change, right? And we begin to set limits to them, right? Set limits to the amount of the number of trees we can harvest out of a forest, set limits to the number of dams we can put on a river. Right natural resource policy, the valuable, cannot be determined with reference to felt preferences alone. Ideals such as living in harmony with nature provide leverage to transcend and criticize mere felt preferences. And not just ideals, but also recognition of interrelationships, right? That ecology teaches us. Provide leverage to transcend and criticize mere felt preferences. All right? Okay. There's an aspect of value in natural resources, in nature, that the pragmatists emphasize more than other thinkers. And Norton calls this, I think this is Weston's term, transformative values. All right? Nature is a teacher of values. Nature offers experiences which provide the basis for value formation, okay? Nature is not merely a repository of values. It's not merely a source for satisfying felt or even considered preferences. It's also a vital source of inspiration for value formation, okay? The transformative value of nature is one more powerful reason for preserving natural resources. Values are transitory and constantly in a process of refinement. Humans need healthy land, air, water, and wildlife to aid us in the ongoing process of refining our values. Okay? A thoroughly anthropocentrized and anthropomorphized world will be less valuable than a world with wild, non-anthropocentrized features because these features are necessary to the formation of healthy, sustainable human lives. All right? So we're kind of cutting out, we're being cast into a Mad Max world where the very basis of making moral judgments is eliminated, and we begin to view the world just instinctively as a war of all against all. right? It's kind of terrifying. But, we need, the point that's made here is that, if we lose our teacher of values, then we lose our civilization. And nature is our teacher of values, right? Because it's all, right? It's through studying nature that we adjust, that we change, that we throw out some values that we realize are not sustainable, right? But if there's no nature left to teach us those things anymore, then we're really disoriented. Yes?
This almost sounds like a counter to the Hobbesian state of nature.
Yes.
It seems like that got polar to that.
Now, Thomas Hobbes, now he's kind of like, he's haunted us. That description of nature as what is it? Nasty, brutish, and short, right? Life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, which is why we need what?
Law.
Which is what?
It's like an ethic.
Social contract is the term that those guys use, right? This is social contract theory. And that shows you, though, there's a big clue to what happened to our culture. There's a big clue to what happened. How did our relationship with nature become so degraded to the point where we're just poisoning and using up everything? And why do we get this crazy when it comes to these things that we also recognize as really valuable and beautiful and things that we might love? What happened? Well, if that's our core view, right? Everything in nature is nasty, brutish, and short. Then that's strongly anthropocentric, right? And we're gonna dominate and conquest, right? Thomas Hobbes is writing in the middle of the 16th century, in the 1500s, right? He's real early. You study Thomas Hobbes in early modern philosophy. That's still early modern philosophy, though, isn't it? Philosophers, sometimes you get a little bit puzzled. Okay, I'm going to sign up for a modern philosophy class. And the first thing you read is David Hume. Think, my God, this was written in 1750. I thought I was taking modern philosophy. Well, you are. Anyway, and then there's early modern philosophy, which of course goes back to the middle of the 1500s. Includes all those old guys, Descartes and Spinoza, who we'll get into a little bit. When we study deep ecology, we'll get into both those guys a little bit, Descartes and Spinoza, and all the metaphysical infirmities that have plagued our culture through Cartesian. The pragmatists and the phenomenologists and the feminists all share a rejection of Cartesianism, Cartesian metaphysics, and they share a rejection of Kantianism. And perhaps even all the way back to Plato, a rejection of Platonism. Anyway, a reversal of Platonism is a term that some people use. All right, so we've been through this already. So what's next here? All right, so now we're going to get some more deeper into Anthony Weston. He's written a few essays, very influential essays in the 90s. He moved on and started doing other things. He kind of stopped doing environmental ethics, but for a while there, he was very influential in the 80s and the 90s. And there we have rejection of Cartesian metaphysics, rejection of subject-object dualism, rejection of means-ends dualism. Every natural resource is both a means and an end. A return to experience discloses that to us, right? We can't isolate. That's an abstraction. That's an ivory tower abstraction. That is not anything we directly experience, this distinction between intrinsic and instrumental. We experience value as a continuum of means and ends and means and ends and means and ends and means and ends, and on and on and on. Okay? Rejection of instrumental intrinsic dualism. Again, another abstraction, another ivory tower result of 2,400 years of philosophical isolation from the real world and from the world of experience. Let's go back to experience, all right? And again, rejection really of axiology, of all these axiological distinctions. I kind of relish, I take pride in my little natural resource values, Will. It took me a while to put all that together, and it's helped me a lot, right? It's helped me understand the relationships among all these different points of view. And I think it helps you guys too. I know years ago, people took my class, and they still report back to me that they're using all this material in their other classes. But I also take pleasure in the destruction. Remember at the end of last class, there's just lines, just erasures all over it, right? It's falling apart, right? It falls apart because we begin to suspect as we go farther along in our journey, right? We throw suspicion onto all these metaphysical assumptions, all these dualisms, right, that I've listed here. And once we throw them out, then we realize that those neat little categorizations and classifications that I give you guys just to help you organize this material, right, ends up being cast into doubt and thrown into some confusion, right? And may not be that valuable and that important anymore. Environmental pragmatists offer a description of valuing and a theory of value which they contend are more accurate, more consistent with human experience of valuing and other animal experiences of valuing than the descriptions of valuing and theories of value offered by Rolston and Collicutt. Both Rolston and Collicutt rely on the idea that land, air, water, wildlife, ecological wholes are bearers of a special kind of value which they call, Rolston calls it intrinsic value, Collicutt wants to reject the word intrinsic and use the word inherent, right? And he wants to do all this conferral, this business of, because he wants to be a consequentialist, but he wants to drive home moral status of ecological wholes. And it may not be possible to be both a consequentialist and to identify objective intrinsic values, non-instrumental values in ecological wholes. And that's why Rolston just says, to hell with subjectivism, to hell with consequentialism. I'm going to put my flag in this more than anthropocentric, objectivistic territory right here, right? Because all the rest is used up, and it falls back under relativity, right? Relativism, cultural relativism. And that's a big problem. If that's the result of Collicutt's theory, then you haven't really made any progress, and we're back there again in anthro land with Norton and those guys, right? All right, anyway. The act of valuing, the experiencing of value in nature are depicted by both Rolston and Collicutt as taking place in linear sequences of the type instrumental, all right, everything instrumental, 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 but then somewhere along the line, we have to go back to, we end up discovering an intrinsic value, right? And that whole linear sequence might not be consistent with experience, right? That's not really what's happening, what Weston and I think Thomas Birch would argue. So, for example, why should we restore Snake River salmon populations? Well, Rolston gives us, if we accept his questionable metaphysical commitments, then Rolston gives us, is very sturdy, right? You guys picked up on that. The more exotic we get on our natural resource values wheel, the more hardcore, right? And John Muir is the most convicted of all, right? Hardcore, save these beautiful places, save these, ecosystems, all these beautiful things, right? Right? If we accept, then it's a very strong argument. If we accept his metaphysical commitment and these dualisms that he relies on, then it is a very powerful argument, isn't it? There are intrinsic values embodied in salmon runs, and we are morally obligated to protect those intrinsic values. Okay? And these are stronger reasons to protect salmon runs than the merely economic reasons, or the other merely anthropocentric reasons. Okay? Weston argues that Rolston and Collicutt's reliance on the concept of intrinsic value, and I think this is also Birch's point, leads them, Rolston and Collicutt, to accept flawed, misleading descriptions of the act of valuing and the experiencing of value in nature. Weston argues that we never actually experience the kinds of values that environmentalists are most interested in defending in neatly divisible packages of instrumental and intrinsic values. Okay? We don't experience endangered species, wilderness, etc. in these packages of instrumental and intrinsic values. Rather, we always experience natural values, especially the kinds of natural values that environmentalists are most interested in defending, as complex webs of intersecting values, all of which are partly instrumental and partly non-instrumental. So this is a better description of the web, this is a web-like description of natural resource values, okay? And this is the linear description up here. But according to the pragmatist description of natural resource values, these are all interrelated, right? Human economic benefits, human more than economic benefits, benefits to biotic communities, benefits to earth, human more than economic, etc. I don't know if that's very helpful, but the point is that Weston wants to give us a very different picture of value in natural resources, right? Values in natural resources are all interconnected and interrelated like the strands in a spider's web. Okay? So that's why Weston wants to talk about webs of value in nature. So Weston and Norton, I'm far more drawn toward Weston's work than Norton's work, but they're both environmental pragmatists. They embrace dramatically different axiological orientations though. All right? Norton is proudly self-described as a weak anthropocentrist. All right? Weston is not, though. He's not an anthropocentrist. but he's also not a non-anthropocentrist, okay? He's neither. Weston flatly rejects the meta-ethical distinction between anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric, and that's what Birch is doing too. The human mind is, of course, situated within the human body, and the human mind can only give us an essentially human outlook on the world. Nevertheless, the human mind is perfectly capable of recognizing and locating centers of value in non-human animals, species, and ecosystems. Weston claims to be offering an account of values in nature which is more true to experience. All right? And by the way, you could maybe, the human mind is perfectly capable of recognizing and locating, and I kind of like to call that compassion, right? That capability that we have, just the capability of taking the point of view of another being, perhaps can fairly accurately be described as compassion. Something to be cultivated, right? Another virtue to be cultivated. So it's because of our compassion that we are not, is what I'm submitting now, suggesting. It's because we have this characteristic, this capability that could be called compassion, that we are not locked into some anthropocentric frame. We're not locked in. We have these minds that are capable of going over there, right? And feeling the world from Roy's point of view, or from a salmon's point of view, because of our capacity for compassion. So we're not just reduced to compassion. Because of our capacity for compassion, it's impossible to reduce our perspective to a strictly anthropocentric. We're not just greedy, avaricious, self-centered animals. We're more than that. Much more than that. We're aspiring animals too, and we aspire toward harmony. So Weston offers an account of values which is more, he claims this is much more true to experience. We don't experience intrinsic values. Okay? We just don't. We don't experience intrinsic values. Intrinsic values as non-natural properties, that's one possibility, that when Rolston and other thinkers who rely on this word, who want to talk about intrinsic values, this is usually what they mean. They mean something like non-natural, which is odd. Right? This goes back to G.E. Moore, by the way, for those of you keeping score. This British analytic philosopher named G.E. Moore was the first guy who started talking about non-natural properties. Anyway, he'll give you a headache. Don't read too much of him, but those analytic philosophers, to pass from immediacy of enjoyment. Okay, this is John Dewey, all right? And Weston quotes John Dewey, and he totally agrees with this. To pass from immediacy of enjoyment to something called intrinsic value is a leap for which there is no ground. Okay, sure, we have immediacy of enjoyment all the time. When you're out enjoying the view of the sunset, from some incredibly beautiful beach somewhere that's protected because of our foresight, you might say, well, there's something intrinsically valuable, but no, you're just immediately enjoying it. Anyway, without any mediation, right? And it's breathtaking to behold, and that's powerful, right? And that's good reason to protect that place. But it doesn't mean that place has intrinsic value. Weston, the two tasks, so this is what Weston prescribes for us as environmental ethicists. This is what we ought to be doing. Our first task is to describe, and this is what Thomas Birch says we ought to be doing too. And by the way, if you need, I have one more copy of Thomas Birch's essay if you need it. And everyone has an extension to hand in the Thomas Birch summary on Tuesday. Okay? So just hand if you haven't handed in, if you need a copy, get my last copy. I can also print out, if there's more than one copy needed, I can print out more copies. All right? But now you know how to get it, so anyway. And you have an extension. Yeah. Turn it in on Tuesday, all right? And next week, the reading's fairly light, I noticed. Both readings for next week are quite short. But they're both on... I've got my work cut out for me. I've never lectured before on Thomas Birch, and I've never lectured on deep ecology either. Actually, I did about 6 years ago. I did lecture on... because we had a section in one of the anthologies. I used to use anthologies, and you guys have to buy books and stuff, but I don't do that anymore. Anyway, but I had to eliminate deep ecology from the curriculum about 3 or 4 years ago because it was just too much. There's just so much time, and so. But now, I'm trying to. So that actually, these last 4 weeks of the term are different than the first 6 weeks of it. We did one 3-week section and then another 3-week section, and now we're into the last 4 weeks of the term, and we're just, next week, the entire week is dedicated to deep ecology. And then we'll do social ecology the week after that, and ecofeminism. But ecofeminism is rightly considered a branch of social ecology. So we'll do one full week on deep ecology and then one full week on social ecology, including ecofeminism. And then we'll do virtue ethics the last week. I think that's how it works. Anyway, but just so you know, keep in mind, so now we're trying to wrestle, and really it looks like this week has been about environmental pragmatism. It really has. It kind of took me a little by surprise. I hadn't really planned it out this way. But when I reread, I read all of these essays many times, and when I got around to rereading this essay again, I realized, hey, this guy's really an environmental pragmatist, or at least I can easily teach him that way. I can package him that way, and you guys can help him. It'll help you understand him a little better by reconstructing some of the metaphysics that are beneath his work and his understanding of what moral philosophy is, which I think is very consistent with William James's understanding of what moral philosophy is, which is why I included this material about pragmatism in today's lecture. So anyway, so it looks like this week we've studied environmental pragmatism. Next week we're studying deep ecology. The week after that, social ecology. And the week after that, virtue ethics. So anyway, you didn't know you had 5 more weeks to go, huh? I'm going to keep you here. You got more. I'm extending the term by 4 weeks. No, by 6 weeks. My daughter goes to school at USF, and they have 12-week semesters, which is far. Excuse me, is it 12-week? No, they're 16-week. Yeah, 16-week semesters. I wish we would have this semester system. Most state schools, I think, and most states are on this, switched over about 20 years ago. Most schools switched over, but Oregon State, and neither did California state schools either. I don't know why. But almost all private schools are on the semester. It's really much better. You need 16 weeks to cover any subject adequately. But here we just rush, and you just wonder. You just wonder, what kind of education, when you're rushing along like that. Anyway, so our first task is to describe and situate natural resource values in their supporting contexts, in the context of the webs of other values which make them meaningful and compelling. Remember, nothing is valuable in isolation. You can't just say it's, unless you want to fall into all these big metaphysical assumptions about intrinsic value and these dualisms and stuff and the Cartesian metaphysics and all this garbage. It's hard to separate values out, right? It's hard to separate, it's hard to explain, to understand why something's valuable unless you understand the valuableness, the value of a whole bunch of other things that it is interrelated with, right? And that's how we identify value in normal life. That's when someone asks you, why do you like that? Then you have to give them a story, right? That has certain parts of your life, you grew up this way, et cetera, right? There's a whole web that you have to explain to people who wonder why you're valuing a certain exotic thing, right? And then once they understand, though, all the connections between that thing that looks kind of exotic and why would anyone value that with all these other things, then hey, then they're reassured and they realize, hey, that kind of makes sense. So Weston wants to describe values in natural resources always being disclosed to us in a web-like pattern with other values, okay? He says, consider a more holistic picture conception according to which values are connected in a web-like way so that any value can be justified by referring to those values which are adjacent to it. To justify or to explain a value is to reveal its organic place among our other values. And then the second task is the more difficult one, very difficult one. And Weston doesn't give us any easy answers about how to go about this second task, but it involves adjudicating conflicts among competing natural resource values and perhaps other sorts of values, right? Because we don't live in the morally optimal universe, right? And there are moral struggles in this universe that we are tragically condemned to live in, then there are going to be conflicts between different moral claims and different moral obligations, right? When this happens, when values do become problematic, when choice is required, then these values need articulation and defense. But to call them intrinsic in Rolston's sense now offers no help, since we have to disconnect objects and actions from their context in order to value them just for what they are in themselves, then this whole web of values that they're part of, what they are in relation to everything else, gets pushed out of focus. What Ralston's defense of the notion of intrinsic values may finally illustrate is the way in which the project of grounding natural values finally cuts itself off from the real-life task of assessment and choice. For assessment and choice, we must learn again to relate values. And so you might wonder, well, okay, well, how does all this end? And it ends just with local democratic meetings between interested stakeholders. Anybody who cares about what somebody's doing to the river or to the forest can show up, and then they just have to hash it out. And they have to, an environmentalist has to do a really good job of trying to explain to the resource extractive community in the rural part of Oregon that those values, which they don't seem to recognize, are actually really important because they're connected with a whole bunch of other values, right? Rural people like to hunt. They do. They like to hunt and fish, right? They like their resource extraction too, but if you can show them that their resource extraction is adversely affecting their hunting and fishing opportunities, the next thing you know, right? And what is that? That's this type of connective work that Weston is talking about, right? Connect the values up. Your Uncle George loves to hunt and fish. He's also a logger, or whatever. And you might have disputes with your Uncle George about how much logging is going on in our forests, especially in our private forests, And Uncle George might argue with you because he likes his timber company check, right? It's provided him with a pretty decent quality of life, in economic, right? So, but once you point out to him, if you can show him and muster all this evidence that clear cut that he used to be in favor of on Mount Hood is going to impact his hunting opportunities, he's going to have second thoughts. He might end up coming over to your side, right? Because you have showed him how the values that you're talking about, the values in forests, etc., are intimately connected, adjacent to some of his values. Okay? All right. So by relating values, we reconstruct our reasons for upholding them, right? We're not giving them a foundation. There is no foundation. They support one another, like a web, right? A web doesn't have a platform holding it up. That would be crazy, right? Imagine if a spider did that, right? They're smarter than that. They don't need to found their web on anything. They just connect it all together, and it's incredibly strong. Some of those spider webs, they put them under little waterfalls in the creek, right? And then they catch fish. Isn't that something? A spider can catch a fish by spinning a web underneath a little waterfall. Just unbelievable. Well, they do that, so how come we can't do that? Anyway, all right. We can, right? We use really big nets, and we use fish wheels, and we catch a whole bunch of fish. Poor little spider, he just catches one at a time. All right. So the essay that I've had my students read in the past is called Between Means and Ends. Right? And this essay is mostly a critique of the concept of intrinsic value. Many environmental ethicists have relied on some version of the concept of intrinsic value to defend the idea that non-human natural entities are bearers of moral as well as legal rights. Okay? The whole turn away from Pinchovian conservationism, as exemplified in the work of Aldo Leopold, is usually understood as a turn toward the claim that non-human natural entities have intrinsic value, not merely instrumental value. Christopher Stone's defense of the legal rights of non-human natural entities is usually interpreted as being based on some notion of nature's intrinsic value. All right? Part of his defense, anyway, the enigmatic part of his defense. All right, remember, there, just like with Leopold, there is an anthro stone and there's a more than anthro stone. Of course, the more than anthro reading of Stone is the really enigmatic one, the one that he doesn't really do much to defend. But he throws it out there, right? Just like Justice Douglas threw it out there too, but both of them are amateurs and they don't really, in those days anyway. Christopher Stone's gotten schooled up since, but so all they could do was kind of wave their hands, right? And Uncle Aldo too. He just kind of waves his hands toward the idea of the biotic rights of a wolf pack or the biotic rights of a species. But he doesn't explain, and I'm still not satisfied with how well we've defended that idea. But anyway, we've done a little more than waving our hands, thanks to Ralston, right? Ralston gives us a little more than hand waving. All right, so intrinsic value is really important, right? But Weston says, no, we don't need this concept of intrinsic value to defend the kinds of things that environmentalists want to defend. Okay? But, again, going back to the golden age of North American environmentalism, this notion of intrinsic value did a lot of work. It might have, at least in retrospect, it can be seen to have done a lot. The Endangered Species Act seems to be predicated on something like, part of it seems to be predicated on the idea that species have objective intrinsic value, right? Especially as the Endangered Species Act was originally written and signed into law by President Nixon. It was very clear. It said there are no exceptions. If a species is endangered, then government agency is obligated to undertake recovery plans. Okay? Even if those recovery plans are economically prohibitive. Right? In other words, there's no exception for economics. There's no exception later they amended the Endangered Species Act, and they did insert some very difficult, but still they inserted some exceptions when the cost of a species recovery or a species protection plan is really, really, really super, super high. Like they have to stop building a dam. That was the famous Tellico Dam, Tennessee. Anyway, the snail darter, and I won't go into that. That's a whole other story. Let's see. All right. So the movement to preserve, but that's half of it, right? Intrinsic value. That's why we want to save species. The other half, of course, is library of unread books, anthropocentric goods, right? That we don't know about yet because we haven't studied them enough, right? So it seems as though both the Endangered Species Act and the Wilderness Act are defended both in terms of instrumental values and in terms of intrinsic values. Okay? Every species is inherently valuable. It's an intrinsic value-based argument for species preservation. Okay? Weston argues that it is counterproductive to try and defend the value of most non-human natural entities on the basis of an appeal to intrinsic value. In the real world, the values that environmentalists want to defend are not ends in themselves. They are either immediate values, like the sunset I was talking about earlier, or they are values as parts of patterns, which is Weston's little pet term. Values as parts of patterns, or webs. Environmentalists, Weston says, would be better served by philosophical work that spells out the relatedness, not the separateness, of values in nature. Okay, so two possibilities other than instrumental values and intrinsic. We're throwing out intrinsic values. Okay, they just don't exist. There are, however, immediate valuing. Some things, events, and experiences are immediately valuable. The sunset at the beach, an uncommon bird at your bird feeder, right? Maybe an ivory-billed woodpecker shows up one day at your bird feeder. That would be certainly an immediate valuing. A child's first steps or first words, the winter's first snowfall. Immediately valuable, right? All of these things. It is misleading, however, to describe things, events, and experiences that are immediately valuable as ends in themselves or as intrinsically valuable. Our valuing of the sunset or the uncommon bird or the winter's first snowfall is connected with larger patterns.